The celebration lasted one day. The first humans touched the red dust, planted a flag, and a whole world watched them wave. Then the cameras turned off, and the survival began. Because arriving on Mars and living on Mars are not the same thing. Outside the wall, the air cannot be breathed. The cold can kill in minutes, and the dust hides poison. Inside, machines hum without rest, turning out oxygen, water, and warmth. And if they stop, so do you. There is no rescue. A cry for help takes many minutes to even reach home. This is not a story of conquering a planet. It is a story of depending on a machine to stay alive, every single day. What would that life really feel like, day after day? If you enjoy stories that take you somewhere strange and make it feel real, take a second to like and subscribe. It honestly helps a small channel like this keep going. No pressure, just glad you're here. Now, are you comfortable? Let's begin. The hardest part of going to Mars is not the launch, and it is not the landing. It is the second morning. The first morning still belongs to history. There were speeches written years in advance. There were billions of people watching screens across a planet they had never thought of as fragile until they saw it from far away, a small blue dot wrapped in cloud. There was the ladder, the boot, the red dust, the flag that could not flutter because there was almost no air to push it. There were tears in mission control and tears in living rooms, and for a few hours the entire human species held one single thought at the same time. We made it. We are no longer a one-world species. We are here. And then the cameras turned off, not because anyone wanted them off, but because there is only so long a moment can last before the next thing has to be done. The fuel has to be checked. The dust has to be logged. The systems that carried 4 human beings across a more than 200 million kilometers of nothing now have to keep those same human beings alive through the night. And the people inside that small pressurized shell discover something that no speech ever quite prepared them for. The hard part was not getting to Mars. The hard part is staying alive on Mars after the applause has faded, and there is no one left watching and nothing left to do except survive. Today, and tomorrow, and the day after that, with no end date written anywhere. That is where this story begins. The morning after, when living on Mars stops being a dream and becomes a job that never clocks out. To even reach this morning, the crew has already spent the better part of a year inside a moving box. The journey to Mars is not the swift leap of films. It is a voyage of roughly 7 to 9 months across a stretch of emptiness so large that the 2 planets must be lined up just right to attempt it at all. A window that opens only about once every 2 years. For all those months, the crew lives in a vessel smaller than the habitat waiting for them, watching Earth shrink to a blue point and then to just another star, watching Mars grow from a red point into a world. They arrive not rested, but worn, having already lived a small lifetime of confinement before they ever touch the ground. And then they land, which is its own ordeal. A descent so violent and so fast through an atmosphere too thin to be much help that engineers speak of it in grim half-jokes and hold their breath through every second of it. But assume it works. Assume the landing is perfect and the celebration is real. The point of all of it, the months in the box and the terror of the descent, was only ever to deliver human beings to the doorstep of a home that machines built for them in advance. The journey was the easy part to imagine. The morning after is the part no one rehearses. So let us be precise about what we even mean by living on Mars. because the phrase hides the most important truth of the whole experience. You will never live on Mars. Not really. Not the way you live on Earth, where you can walk outside, breathe without thinking, feel the sun on your skin, and trust that the air will still be there in an hour. On Mars, you will live inside Mars-shaped machines that hold a thin pocket of Earth-like conditions, apart from a planet that is trying every single second to pull that pocket back into balance with itself. You will not be a resident of a new world. You will be a passenger inside a small, humming bubble of borrowed Earth. And the planet outside will never once agree to let that bubble exist. It will simply be held at bay by hardware, by power, and by constant human attention. To understand why, you have to understand what is waiting on the other side of the wall. When you wake on your first ordinary morning, before you open your eyes, the first thing you notice is the sound. It is not silence. It is a low, layered hum that never fully stops. Fans moving air so it does not go stale and pool with the carbon dioxide you breathe out. Pumps pushing water through filters, a compressor somewhere maintaining pressure. The faint tick and whir of machines whose only purpose is to keep the inside of the room different from the outside of the room. On Earth, you fall asleep to the sound of wind or traffic or nothing at all. On Mars, you fall asleep and wake up to the sound of the equipment that is keeping you alive. After a while, the crews who train for this say, you stop hearing it. And then one day it changes pitch, and you hear it instantly, because some part of your brain has been listening the entire time without telling you. That wall a few feet away from your face is the most important object in your life now, and it is doing something violent and constant that you cannot feel. On the inside of the wall is air at roughly the pressure you are used to, breathable, warm, familiar. On the outside of the wall is the Martian atmosphere, and it is almost nothing. The surface pressure on Mars is, on average, less than 1% of the pressure at sea level on Earth. Approximately 0.6%. That is so thin, it barely deserves the word atmosphere at all. And the little that is there is not air you could ever use. It is about 95% carbon dioxide, the gas your own body produces as waste and works hard to expel. There is almost no oxygen in it. People imagine that the danger of stepping outside on Mars is that you would suffocate, the way you might in a room with no oxygen. The reality is stranger and faster than that. The air outside is so thin that it is closer to the vacuum of space than to anything we would call weather. At that pressure, exposed to that near emptiness, the water in your body would begin to turn to vapor. You could be holding a tank of pure oxygen and a mask pressed to your face, and it would not save you, because the problem is not only what you are breathing, it is the crushing absence of pressure itself trying to pull your body apart from the inside. This is why the wall matters so much. The wall is not keeping out cold or wind. The wall is the only reason your blood stays liquid. And here is a detail that changes how you picture the whole scene. The crew did not build the place they woke up in. They could not have. You cannot carry a habitat, a power plant, an oxygen factory, and years of supplies on the same ship that carries the people, not on the first attempts. And so the plan that nearly every serious agency converges on is to send the machines ahead of the humans. Cargo first, people later. Years before the crew ever launches, uncrewed ships would land on Mars carrying the bones of the base. Robots would unfold solar arrays or set a reactor running. The oxygen and fuel plants would begin their slow work in the empty cold, with no one there to watch. By the time human beings finally strap in for the voyage out, Mission Control would already know that the habitat on Mars holds pressure, that the power flows, that there is breathable air and stored water, and, most important of all, a fueled vehicle waiting to carry them off the surface again someday. The people are sent only after the machines have proven they can keep people alive. Sit with what that means for the morning after the landing. The crew is utterly dependent, from their very first breath on the surface, on equipment that robots assembled in advance that has been running unattended for years, that they did not design and cannot fully see inside. They are trusting their lives to a base built on faith and telemetry, sent ahead into the dark and left to run alone. And if it fails now, the people who must fix it are the very people depending on it to breathe. So here is the first thing to hold on to. The idea that everything else in this story hangs from. The habitat you live in is not a house. It is a building-sized spacesuit. It is a single pressurized garment large enough to walk around inside of. And like any spacesuit, the moment it fails, the planet comes in. A house on Earth keeps out rain and cold and strangers, and if a window breaks, you sweep up the glass and call someone in the morning. A habitat on Mars keeps out the vacuum, and if it breaks, you have seconds, not hours. And there's no one to call who can reach you in time. Everything you are about to learn about daily life on Mars flows from that one fact. You are not living in shelter. You are living inside life support that happens to be shaped like rooms. And life support is not one machine. It is many, and not one of them is allowed to rest. Start with pressure, since that is the thing keeping your body intact. The habitat has to hold its internal pressure steady against a near vacuum that is always pressing the other way, looking for any gap. Every seal, every airlock, every joint where one panel meets another is a place where the inside is trying to leak out into the outside, slowly and silently. A small leak is not a dramatic event. There is no hiss, no alarm at first. There is just a number on a screen that creeps in the wrong direction over hours, and a system that has to notice it and either patch it or pump more air to make up the loss. On Earth, the air around you is free and infinite. On Mars, every breath of pressure inside the wall had to be carried from Earth or manufactured on site, which means a leak is not just a safety problem. It is a slow drain on a resource that cannot be replaced by opening a window. The people inside live with a low, permanent awareness that the room they're standing in is, very gently, always trying to empty itself into the sky. Now think about the air itself, the part you breathe, because that is not free either. On Earth, plants and oceans have spent billions of years filling the sky with oxygen, and you inherit all of it for nothing. On Mars, there is no such inheritance. Every molecule of oxygen inside the habitat is there because a machine put it there, and a machine has to keep putting it there, because you are using it up with every breath and turning it into carbon dioxide that has to be removed before it builds to a level that would quietly poison you. This is not science fiction. We've already taken the first real step. On the Perseverance rover, which has been working on Mars since the year 2021, there was a small experiment with a name that sounds almost playful, Moxie. Its job was to take the thin Martian air, that 95% carbon dioxide, and pull the oxygen out of it. And it worked. Over and over, in different seasons and at different times of day, It produced breathable oxygen from the atmosphere of another planet. It was small, about the size of a car battery, and it made only a trickle, enough for a few minutes of breathing at a time, but it proved the principle. The air of Mars can be turned into something a human can use. That is confirmed. That happened. What has not happened yet is doing it at the scale that keeps 4 people, or 40 or 400, alive indefinitely. That is the leap between a demonstration and a home. A crew on the surface would need oxygen plants many times larger, running continuously, with backups for the backups, because the moment oxygen production falls behind oxygen consumption, a clock starts ticking that nobody can stop by trying harder. You cannot will more oxygen into a sealed room. You can only make it, store it, or run out of it. And the carbon dioxide you exhale has to be scrubbed out at the same time by yet another system, because in a sealed bubble, the gas you breathe out does not blow away on a breeze. It stays. It accumulates. It has to be captured by hardware that, like everything else here, is not permitted to stop. You can already feel the shape of the problem forming. Pressure, oxygen, carbon dioxide. 3 separate systems, each one essential, each one running every second of every day. And every one of them needs the same thing to keep running. Power. Power is the root that everything else grows out of. The fans need power. The oxygen plant needs power. The pumps that move your water and the scrubbers that clean your air and the heaters that keep you from freezing all need power. And they need it without interruption, because the systems that keep you alive cannot be switched off at night to save energy the way you might turn off a light. On Earth, if the power goes out, you light a candle and wait, annoyed but safe. On Mars, if the power goes out and stays out, the machines stop, and when the machines stop, the planet begins, slowly, to come inside. The temperature starts falling. The air starts going stale. The pressure begins its quiet leak. Power is not a convenience on Mars. It is the thing standing between the crew and the planet, and it has to flow continuously. Through the night, through storms, through every breakdown, forever. There are 2 main ways to make that power, and both have a shadow. Sunlight is free and endless in principle, and solar panels have run our robots on Mars for decades. But sunlight on Mars is weaker than on Earth, because Mars is farther from the sun, and the panels are at the mercy of the sky. And the Martian sky is not always clear. Dust storms can rise without much warning and choke the sky with haze, starving the solar panels of light at the very moment the crew can do nothing but wait. The other path is nuclear, a compact reactor that does not care whether the sun is shining, humming out steady heat and electricity regardless of the weather. That kind of power source is being designed and tested precisely because the sun on Mars cannot be fully trusted. But a reactor is one more complex machine that must be maintained, far from any factory that built it, by the same handful of people who are also responsible for everything else. And while all of that is happening, something else is pressing on the wall that you would never think about on Earth. Because on Earth, it is simply not a problem. The cold. The average temperature on the surface of Mars is roughly minus 60 degrees Celsius. Not on a bad night, on an ordinary one. In some places and seasons, it falls far below that. A planet that cold pulls heat out of anything warmer than itself, relentlessly, through every wall and window and seam. So the habitat does not only have to make its own air and hold its own pressure and generate its own power, it also has to make its own warmth, constantly, and hold that warmth against a world that is forever draining it away. Heating is just one more machine in the chain one more thing that needs power, one more thing that cannot stop. On Earth, the cold is a season. On Mars, the cold is the default state of the universe outside your wall, and your survival depends on a heater that never gets to rest. And the cold on Mars behaves in a way that Earth never prepared anyone for, because the thin air holds almost no heat at all. On Earth, the atmosphere is a thick blanket that traps warmth, so the gap between afternoon and the dead of night is usually mild. Mars has almost no blanket. The little warmth that the weak sunlight delivers to the ground by day escapes back to space almost the instant the sun goes down, and the temperature can plunge by tens of degrees between afternoon and dawn. At a single spot near the equator, the ground at noon might climb close to the freezing point of water, almost gentle, while that same spot a few hours later falls to a cold, deeper than anything in the harshest Earth winter. For the habitat, this means the heaters can never settle. They fight a cold that deepens every night, and an outside temperature that lurches up and down with the turning of the planet, and they must hold the inside steady through all of it, because the human body has a narrow band of warmth it can survive and no tolerance for the swings the planet takes for granted. And the wall holding the crew's warmth inside is the only thing between them and a cold that would kill within hours if the heat ever failed. One more job the hardware can never set down. Even time itself does not quite fit. A day on Mars, one full turn of the planet, lasts about 24 hours and 39 minutes. That sounds close enough to Earth to ignore, and that is exactly the trap. Those extra 39 minutes do not disappear. They stack. Each day, your schedule slides a little later relative to the clock you grew up with. And over a couple of weeks, your noon and the planet's noon drift completely out of step, then slowly back again. Crews who live on Martian time have to wear it like a second skin, resetting their bodies to a day that is almost, but not quite, the rhythm a human being was built for. It is a small thing compared to running out of oxygen, but it is one more way that the planet quietly refuses to match you. One more way that everything here, even the length of a day, has to be managed rather than simply lived. Now picture the place where all of this is happening. Not a gleaming domed city under a glass sky. That image is comforting, and it is almost certainly wrong, at least at first. The earliest real homes on Mars are far more likely to be small, thick-walled, and partly buried, because the same wall that holds your pressure also has to help shield you from the radiation pouring down from a sky with no protective magnetic field above it. A glass dome would be beautiful, and would also let in the very thing you most need to keep out. So the first residents are more likely to live in something closer to a bunker than a mansion, with thick shielding overhead, perhaps soil piled on the roof, perhaps walls printed from the Martian ground itself by machines that arrived before the people did. Windows would be few, small, and precious, not because of any failure of imagination, but because every window is a weak point in a wall whose entire job is to keep a hostile planet out. Inside that buried shell, the space is tight. The first Martian home is measured in a small number of rooms, shared by a small number of people who will see each other every waking hour for a year or more, with no door they can walk out of to be alone under an open sky. We will return to what that does to the human mind, because it matters enormously. For now, simply hold the picture. A handful of people in a handful of rooms, beneath a layer of shielding, surrounded on every side by a planet that offers them nothing they can use and would erase them in minutes if the wall ever failed. And here is the part that makes daily life on Mars so different from daily life anywhere on Earth. None of these systems are background. On Earth, the machinery that keeps you alive is hidden so well you forget it exists. Power plants you will never see, water treatment you never think about, an entire atmosphere maintained by a living planet without asking anything of you. You get to spend your attention on work, on people, on art, on boredom, on joy. Because survival has been handled by systems too large and too old to notice. On Mars, there are no systems too large to notice. There is only the equipment in the next room, run by the people in this room, and if that equipment fails and no one catches it, no larger world steps in to save them. The maintenance of life is not handled by the planet. It is a daily chore on the to-do list, sitting right alongside meals and sleep, and it is the chore that can never, ever be skipped. There is one more principle built into a base like this, and it is the quiet rule that everything else obeys. Anything that can kill you is not allowed to exist only once. A single oxygen plant is a death sentence waiting for a bad day, so there are 2 or 3. A single pump, a single power source, a single way to scrub the air. Each one is a thread that, cut, ends the crew, and so each one is doubled, shadowed by a backup ready to take up the work the instant the first one falters. Spare parts are packed by the thousands, chosen years in advance by people straining to imagine every way a machine might break. This is what engineers call redundancy, and on Mars it is not mere caution. It is the entire difference between a setback and a funeral. On Earth, if your home loses power, the redundancy is the whole civilization around you. The repair crews, the spare everything, the neighbor with a generator. On Mars, the only redundancy that exists is the redundancy the crew carried with them, and the spares stacked in a storeroom, and when those run out, they run out for good. A settlement is only as alive as its deepest backup. The first Martians would live their whole lives inside a structure designed around the assumption that things will fail, because they will, and the only question that ever matters is whether something was waiting to take over when they did. So the crew lives inside a kind of bargain they renew every single day, without ever signing it. As long as the pressure holds, and the oxygen flows, and the carbon dioxide is scrubbed, and the power runs, and the heat stays on, they get to have an ordinary day. They get to eat breakfast and do their work and talk to each other and be tired and be bored and be human. The machines, when they're working, give them back the gift that Earth gives away for free. The gift of not having to think about staying alive. When you wake on that ordinary morning and the hum is steady and the numbers on the screens are where they should be, it means the bargain held through the night. The wall did its job. The planet stayed outside. You were still a warm, breathing, intact human being in a small pocket of borrowed Earth, 200 million kilometers from the place that made you. So you get up, and the first thing you do, before the work, before the science, before anything that sounds like exploration, is the most ordinary act imaginable. You reach for a glass of water. You think about breakfast. You think about a shower. And every single one of those small, simple human things, the water and the food and the wash, turns out to be its own quiet act of engineering, drawn from systems that are just as fragile and just as unforgiving as the ones keeping the air in the room. Because on Mars, nothing is ordinary. Not even the morning. And to see why, we have to follow that first glass of water all the way back to where it came from. Follow the water. You reach for that first glass on your first ordinary morning, and the water that fills it has a history. On Earth, water has no history you ever need to know. It falls from the sky, runs down mountains, collects in reservoirs, and arrives at your tap having been cleaned by people you will never meet. Drawn from a cycle so vast and so old that you can drink a glass, pour the rest down the drain, and never once feel the loss. The planet makes more. It always has. On Mars, the water in your glass was almost certainly inside another human being not long ago. It was breath fogging a visor. It was sweat wiped from a forehead during exercise. It was, to put it plainly, urine run through filters and membranes and chemical treatment until it came out the far end clean, clear, and safe, ready to be a glass of water again. This is not a grim exception on Mars. This is the whole design. A crew living far from Earth cannot afford to use water once and let it go. There is no river outside the wall, no rain, no reservoir, nothing in the cold ground that arrives already pure. So the habitat runs water in a closed loop, capturing nearly every drop the crew produces and feeding it back into the supply. On the orbiting station above Earth, engineers have already pushed this recycling to recover about 98% of the water the crew uses, reclaiming it from urine, from sweat, even from the humidity that collects in the air as people simply breathe and live. The moisture in your exhaled breath does not drift away on Mars. It is collected, condensed, and returned to you as drinking water. Nothing is allowed to leave the loop, because outside the loop, there is nothing. And a loop is a fragile thing. On Earth, the water system is so enormous that no single failure can empty it. On Mars, the entire water supply for the crew passes through a compact stack of pumps, filters, and treatment units. And if that stack falters, the loop begins to break down. Filters clog, membranes foul, pumps wear. Each of these is a routine maintenance item. The Martian equivalent of changing a household filter, except that here the household has no plumber to call and no store to visit. And the thing being maintained is the only water the crew will ever have. So the recycling system is not a background utility. It is a daily responsibility, monitored, cleaned, and repaired by the same people drinking from it. You do not simply use water on Mars, you tend the machine that gives it back to you, and you do it knowing that the machine and your own body are now part of the same circle. The crew can stretch that circle by pulling new water from Mars itself, and this is one of the genuine reasons a settlement could survive at all. Mars is not bone dry the way the old maps suggested. There is water ice locked in the ground across huge regions of the planet, especially towards the poles and beneath the surface at mid-latitudes, frozen into the soil like mortar holding sand together. Machines can dig it, heat it, and release that water to top up the loop, replacing the small fraction that even the best recycling cannot recover. But here the planet plays one of its quiet tricks. That same Martian soil is laced with the perchlorate salts we will return to again and again in this story, and any water pulled from the ground comes contaminated with them. The water has to be cleaned of the very poison the planet stirred into it before a human can drink it or grow food with it. Even the gift of buried ice arrives with a catch, and the catch has to be removed by yet another process, run by the same small crew, drawing on the same finite power. There is a reason the machines have to arrive first, and it goes deeper than comfort. A base that cannot make things out of Mars, is not a base. It is a tent with a clock running down. Everything carried from Earth is finite the moment it lands, and the distance home is too great and too slow to keep a settlement supplied by delivery. So the first task of those advanced machines is not exploration. It is manufacturing. Consider the single most important thing they would make. The thing that turns a one-way trip into a survivable one. Fuel for the journey back. The plan that engineers keep returning to is to leave Earth without the propellant for the return flight at all, and instead make it on Mars, out of Mars before the crew even departs. The thin Martian air, almost entirely carbon dioxide, can be combined with hydrogen, much of it drawn from Martian water, and run through a chemical reaction discovered more than a century ago to produce methane and oxygen. The fuel and the fire a rocket needs to climb off the surface. A plant the size of a small building, running for a year or more in the cold and the dark. Slowly filling tanks with a return ticket distilled out of the planet itself. The crew would not launch from Earth until those tanks were confirmed full. Their way home would be manufactured before their way out had even begun. The same logic reaches into the walls around them. The thick shielding the crew lives under does not all have to be hauled across the solar system. Much of it can be made from the ground they landed on, Martian soil packed over the roof, or bound together and printed into building shells by machines that arrived ahead of the people, turning the very dust of the planet into a barrier against the planet. A mature settlement would aim to make as much of itself as possible out of what is already there, because every kilogram it does not have to ship from Earth is a kilogram that can be something else. Living on Mars, in the end, would mean living inside a place that is slowly eating the planet to build itself. Now think about breakfast, because food is the next thread, and it is wound around the water and the air far more tightly than anything in an Earth kitchen. For the first cruise, most of the food does not come from Mars at all. It comes from Earth, packed years in advance, dried and sealed and engineered to survive an interplanetary voyage, and then sit on a shelf in a cold habitat for a very long time without spoiling. It is calorie dense, nutritionally balanced, and relentlessly the same. The crews who have lived through long isolation studies describe a particular kind of weariness that has nothing to do with hunger. It is the weariness of knowing, before you open the package, exactly what is inside it, and knowing it again tomorrow and the day after for a year. Food on Earth is pleasure, culture, surprise, comfort. Food on Mars in the beginning is fuel that you eat on schedule, because your body is a machine that also cannot be allowed to run down, and the menu has been chosen by a supply chain stretched across the solar system. So the crews try to grow something fresh, and this is where the elegance and the danger of the whole arrangement reveal themselves at once. Inside the habitat, under banks of artificial light tuned to the colors plants use, crops grow without soil, their roots fed by water carrying dissolved nutrients. The recent isolation missions inside the printed habitat at the agency's center in Houston included exactly this. A small indoor garden of leafy greens and vegetables tended through a simulated Martian year, partly for the food and very much for the spirit, because something happens to a person who has been sealed inside walls for months when they're handed a fresh leaf to eat. It is green. It is alive. It tastes of the planet they left behind. The crews of these missions spoke when they came out of missing green grass and blue sky, and the feeling of fresh air on the face, and a living plan is the closest thing inside the wall to any of those. But a garden on Mars is not a separate, gentle hobby running alongside the survival systems. It is wired straight into them. The plants drink from the same water loop that the crew drinks from, so every litre given to the garden is a litre accounted for. The plants breathe, taking in the carbon dioxide the crew exhales, and giving back oxygen, which means the garden is quietly part of the air system too. A small living contributor to the same balance the machines are maintaining. And the plants need light, which means power, and the same power feeding the heaters and the pumps and the oxygen plant. Grow more food and you spend more water, more power, more space, more of the crew's limited hours. The garden is beautiful, and it is also one more system that has to be balanced against all the others. Because on Mars there is no such thing as a resource that belongs to only one purpose. Water is food, is air, is power, is heat. Pull on any one thread and the whole web shifts. And the food, monotonous as it is, does one thing the supply chain never planned for. It gathers people. On a world where the day is mostly survival and maintenance, the shared meal becomes the one fixed point that is purely human. The hour when the crew stops being operators of a machine and becomes briefly a household. They eat together because there is nowhere else to eat, and no one else to eat with. And over time, that necessity hardens into ritual, the closest thing to a campfire on a planet that has no fire to spare. The isolation studies bear this out plainly. The table, the small marking of a birthday or a milestone, the simple act of preparing something and handing it to someone, these become the load-bearing structure of a crew's week. The part of the day everything else is arranged around. Around that ritual sits something an Earth life rarely has to think about: the simple scarcity of private space. The habitat is small, and a handful of people share nearly every cubic meter of it, working in the same rooms, passing each other in the same narrow places, keeping the same hours. The one piece of solitude is a sleeping cabin barely larger than a closet, with a door that closes and a few hours behind it that belong to one person alone. Everything beyond that door is shared. Daily life becomes a constant, low choreography of bodies in a tight space, a learned courtesy about noise and timing and room, the unspoken etiquette that forms whenever people live shoulder to shoulder for a long while, and the hours the machines leave free are shared hours too. Recreation on Mars is whatever the crew carried with them, packed before launch, the books and films and music, the games, the hobbies a person can fold into a few square feet of a common room. People read, exercise for pleasure as much as for duty, linger over the garden a little longer than they have to, make small things, keep small routines. It is a domestic kind of leisure, quiet and indoor and close, folded into whatever corner of the common space happens to be free. To live on Mars would mean that even rest happens inside the wall, in a space you can cross in a few steps, woven into the same small world as the work. And then there is the simplest, most human need of all, the one nobody puts on a mission poster: keeping clean. On Earth, a shower is so ordinary that we use it to wake up, to think, to waste a little time. Hot water runs over you and down a drain and is simply gone. More of it available the moment you want it. On Mars, that is impossible, and not for one reason, but for several at once. Liquid water does not behave on a low-gravity world or in a sealed cabin the way it does in an Earth bathroom. It clings, it floats into the wrong places, it gets into equipment that must stay dry, and every drop you used would have to be captured and run back through the loop. So the long steaming shower is one of the first comforts the planet takes away. In its place come rinseless cleansers, damp cloths, waterless shampoos, careful sponge washing of one part of the body at a time, every bit of moisture recovered afterward. Crews on the orbiting station have lived this way for decades, and they manage and they stay healthy, and they also say plainly that it is one of the things they most look forward to undoing when they come home. A real shower becomes a fantasy you save for Earth, and there is no laundry. That sentence sounds trivial until you sit with it. Washing clothes takes large amounts of water and power. The two things a Martian habitat can least afford to spend on cleaning fabric. And so the simplest answer is the one already used in orbit above Earth, where for decades crews have worn their clothing until it is too dirty to wear, and then simply thrown it out. On the station, the discarded clothes are packed into cargo ships that burn up over Earth. The problem erased by a whole planet's sky. Mars offers no such convenience. So worn-out clothing simply accumulates. One more thing the settlement has to store, manage, or learn to reclaim, because the planet outside will take nothing off their hands. It is a small thing, and that's exactly why it matters. It shows how completely the ordinary luxuries of Earth dissolve on Mars, not in some single dramatic deprivation, but in 1,000 quiet subtractions. No long shower, no fresh change of clothes whenever you like, no throwing anything truly out. Every object the crew uses has a beginning that had to be carried or made, and an end that has to be dealt with. And in between, it is theirs to look after. Even getting dressed in the morning is touched by the same unforgiving accounting that rules the air and the water. Waste follows the same unforgiving logic. On Earth, what your body discards is flushed away into a system so large, you never think of it again. On Mars, there is no away. Human waste has to be collected, contained, and managed with great care, partly because the habitat is a sealed environment where nothing harmful can be allowed to escape into the air the crew breathes, and partly because even waste is a resource that cannot simply be thrown out the door onto a planet the crew is also trying not to contaminate. The toilet on a long mission is not a fixture you ignore. It is a piece of equipment with its own ways of failing, its own maintenance, its own importance to the health of everyone inside. When that system breaks, it is not an embarrassment. It is a genuine emergency, because in a closed bubble, there is nowhere for the problem to go. The most basic, private, forgettable act of being alive becomes, on Mars, one more machine to monitor. Even rest does not come easily here. We have already seen how the Martian day runs slightly longer than an Earth day, sliding the schedule a little later with every turn of the planet. But the deeper problem with sleep is not the clock on the wall. It is the missing sky. On Earth, your body knows when to sleep because it can feel the sun, the brightening and fading of a light. It was built across millions of years to read. Inside a shielded, mostly windowless habitat, that signal is gone. The only sun the crew gets is artificial, banks of lamps tuned and timed to imitate a day, telling the body when to wake and when to rest, because nothing else will. It works, but imperfectly, and crews on long missions know the result intimately. The shallow sleep, the daytime fog, the sense of an internal clock that has slipped its moorings. And lost sleep is not a private misery on Mars. It is an operational hazard. A tired mind misreads a gauge, fumbles a repair, grows short with a crewmate it will face again at breakfast and at every meal for a year. On a world where attention is survival, the plain inability to sleep well becomes one more tax the planet levies, every night on people who cannot afford to pay it. There is a particular feeling to living inside air that a machine has made, and the crew would come to know it the way you know the smell of your own home, which is to say they would mostly stop noticing it. The air in a sealed habitat is processed air. It is scrubbed and filtered and circled around again and again, held at the right mix and the right humidity by systems that never rest. And it carries a faint, clean, slightly flat quality that long-duration crews learn to recognize. The absence of all the living richness an earth breeze carries without our ever thinking about it. No pollen, no soil, no rain, no green growing smell except the small one rising from the garden. Just engineered air, the same air going around again. The habitat also tends to run dry because moisture is a thing to be captured and reclaimed, not left adrift. Skin chaps, throats tire, and every so often a faint wrongness in the smell of the place would be the first warning of a problem. A filter falling behind, a system straining, the planet pressing in by some small degree. Because in a sealed world, even the quality of the air is information, and the crew would learn to read it the way a sailor reads the sky. For years, the crew would breathe an atmosphere a machine assembles for them, trusting it with every breath, and reading in their own lungs the first moment it begins to falter. Now at the part of the day that exists only because the planet itself, it is working against the human body in a way you cannot see or feel. Exercise. On the orbiting station, crews spend around 2 hours of every single day exercising, strapped into machines that let them run and pull and press against resistance. And they do this not for vanity and not entirely for health in the way we mean it on Earth. They do it to slow down a decline that begins the moment a human leaves the full pull of their home planet. Without the constant downward tug of Earth gravity loading the bones and muscles, the body reads the new lightness as a message. You no longer need to be this strong, and it begins, quietly and efficiently, to take itself apart. 2 hours of hard daily exercise is the price crews pay just to slow that unraveling, and even then, they do not stop it completely. Mars is gentler than the empty orbit of the station, because Mars has gravity, about 38% of Earth's, enough that things fall, enough that you can walk rather than float. But 38% is not 100%. And the honest truth is that nobody yet knows exactly what years in that in-between pull will do to the human body, because no human has ever lived in it. It is more than the weightlessness we understand and far less than the gravity we evolved under, a level of pull that exists nowhere we have ever tested a living person for the long term. So the exercise does not go away on Mars. The crew still climbs onto the machines, still gives up a large block of every day to the work of staying strong, because the alternative is to let the low gravity slowly weaken them in a place where weakness is the last thing a person can afford. We will come back to what that partial gravity may do over months and years, because it is one of the slow dangers that defines this story. For now, simply add it to the day. Wake, tend the water, eat the food, clean the body, and exercise hard. Not to feel good, but to keep the planet from taking your strength while you are not looking. Only after all of that does the crew get to the work they actually came to do. The science, the exploration, the reason any of this is worth attempting. But here is the truth about that work, the part that rarely survives onto the recruitment posters. For all that the crew crossed the solar system to do science, the largest single share of their working hours would not be spent on discovery at all. It would be spent on maintenance, keeping the machines alive, This is not a guess. On the orbiting station above Earth, the crew spends a remarkable portion of every working week simply servicing the place they live in, repairing pumps, swapping filters, chasing down faults, cleaning, inspecting, fixing what broke and forestalling what is about to. A station like a Martian base is a machine complicated enough that it is always, somewhere, slightly broken, and keeping it running is not a chore that ever gets finished. It is the job. On Mars, with no repair crew to call and no replacement to be flown in next week, that burden falls entirely on the few people inside, who must be their own plumbers, electricians, mechanics, and engineers, fluent in every system, because their lives depend on systems only they can mend. So the romantic picture inverts. The explorer who came to study a new world spends most of the day as a caretaker of the box that keeps them alive. And the science, the actual reason for being there, gets squeezed into the hours the machines leave free. To live on Mars would be to discover that the great adventure is mostly upkeep, and that the upkeep is not optional. Because the day you fall behind on maintenance is the day the machine begins, quietly, to fail. And even here, surrounded by an entire unexplored world, daily life is shaped by one persistent enemy that gets into everything, that no wall fully stops, and that turns the simple act of going outside into one of the most carefully managed routines on the planet. The dust. Mars is a world painted in dust. It is the reason the planet glows that rusty red across the night sky. The color of iron that long ago combined with oxygen. An entire surface gone to fine reddish powder. And that powder is not like the dust on Earth. Earth dust is mostly harmless grit. Martian dust is something closer to a slow poison ground, into a powder so fine it behaves almost like smoke. Its grains are tiny, far smaller than the dust that gathers on a shelf at home. Small enough to slip deep into human lungs and stay there. Small enough to ride on the faintest movement of air. Small enough to work its way into seals and joints and machinery. And it carries, woven all through it, the same perchlorate salts that contaminate the groundwater, along with fine silica, microscopic iron oxide particles, and traces of metals that no one wants inside their body. A 2025 study in the journal of one of the major scientific unions, led by a team of medical and earth science researchers, looked carefully at what that dust is actually made of and what it would do to a human who breathed it over many months. The findings were not reassuring. The silica alone could scar the lungs the way it scars the lungs of miners and stonecutters on Earth, a condition that has no cure. The perchlorates could attack the thyroid, throwing off the body's hormones, and much of the rest sits somewhere between worrying and unknown, which on Mars is its own kind of warning. This is why going outside is never casual. On Earth, you open a door and step into the air. On Mars, stepping outside means putting on a pressurized surface suit, your own personal version of the habitat. A sealed garment that does for one human body what the walls do for the whole crew. It holds your pressure, feeds you oxygen, keeps you warm against the deep cold, and stands between your skin and a near vacuum that would otherwise pull you apart. The suit is survival you wear, and then, having sealed yourself inside it, you pass through an airlock, a small chamber that lets you leave the pressurized habitat without letting all its precious air rush out into the thin Martian sky behind you. The airlock is a careful trade, cycling you from the inside world to the outside world a few cubic meters at a time, losing only what it must. But the dust does not respect the airlock. It clings to the suit while you work outside, drawn to it, coating the fabric and the joints and the boots in a fine reddish film. And when you cycle back through the airlock to come home, the dust tries to come with you. This is not a theory. We watched it happen on the moon. The Apollo crews, gone for only a few days each, came back into their landers filthy with lunar dust that had clung to everything. And it got into their eyes and noses and throats. And one astronaut who breathed it described the reaction as a kind of lunar hay fever. The dust scratched at instruments, jammed seals, and ground into the joints of their suits so badly that the engineers worried about how long the equipment could survive it. That was a visit measured in days. Mars is a stay measured in years, with dust that is finer and more chemically hostile than anything on the moon, and the same brutal arithmetic. Every excursion outside brings a little of the planet's poison back toward the door. So an enormous amount of thought and an enormous amount of daily effort goes into keeping that dust on the outside of the wall where it belongs. Designs for Martian habitats include clever tricks for this: suits that attach to the outside of the habitat through a sealed port so that a crew member can climb into them from inside and step away onto the surface without the dusty suit ever entering the living space at all, leaving the contamination locked outside. There are dust removal chambers, special airlocks meant to strip and capture as much of the powder as possible before a person re-enters. There is constant cleaning of filters that pull dust out of the cabin air, because no system is perfect, and some powder always finds a way in. And there is the simple, unglamorous, never-ending labor of wiping surfaces, clearing vents, and watching for the telltale signs that the planet has crept a little further inside than it should have. The dust is not an event. It is a presence, and managing it is a chore that appears on the daily list and never comes off it. And looming over all of this, over the suits and the airlocks and the careful dust protocols, is the storm. Martian dust storms can begin in one region and spread until they swallow areas the size of continents. And in rare, enormous events, they can wrap the entire planet in haze for weeks. When that happens, the world outside the window turns a dim, sunless orange, and the solar panels that may be feeding the habitat see their power collapse toward a trickle, exactly when the crew can do nothing but stay sealed inside and wait. A dust storm on Mars does not threaten to blow the habitat over. The air is far too thin for that, despite what dramatic films suggest. The threat is quieter and more serious. It is the loss of light, the loss of power, the burial of equipment, and the patient infiltration of dust into every system while the crew is trapped indoors with no way to clean the surface and no idea exactly how long the sky will stay closed. Step back now and look at the whole shape of this ordinary day. Because the shape is the point. The crew member wakes inside life support shaped like rooms. They drink water that was recently part of their own body. Tended by a machine they must also repair. They eat food carried from another planet, or grown in a garden that is itself part of the air and water and power systems it depends on. They clean themselves without a true shower, manage their own waste as a sealed system hazard, and give up 2 hours to exercise that exists only to keep an indifferent low gravity from quietly weakening them. And when at last they suit up to step outside and do the very work they cross the solar system to do, even that is an exercise in keeping the planet's fine, poisonous dust from following them home. None of this is the disaster. Notice that. Nothing in this entire day has gone wrong. The walls held, the water flowed, the food was eaten, The suit sealed. This is the good day, the ordinary day, the one the mission planners hope for. And it is still a day in which every single human act, drinking, eating, washing, breathing, going outside, runs through a machine that cannot be allowed to fail, monitored by people who cannot afford to look away. The labor of simply staying alive does not fade into the background on Mars the way it does on Earth. It is the foreground. It is the job. It is most of the day. A crew can do this. The isolation studies prove it. Human beings are astonishingly good at turning even this into routine, at making the extraordinary feel normal, at laughing and working and getting bored inside a sealed bubble on a hostile world. That is the quiet triumph buried in all of it. But routine has a way of hiding things. While the crew is busy keeping the water flowing and the dust out and the garden alive, other dangers are at work that no daily chore can hold back. Dangers that do not announce themselves in a single bad morning. They arrive slowly, invisibly, in the radiation pouring through the roof, in the long unraveling of bone and muscle under that strange partial gravity, in the weight of being shut in with the same few faces, and in the silence of a home world too far away to answer quickly when it matters most. Those are the dangers that do not break the day. They break the months. And to understand why life on Mars would truly be horrifying, we have to leave the daily routine behind and follow those slow, patient threats into the body, into the mind, and into the long, aching distance between Mars and home. A good day on Mars ends with everyone alive, the systems humming, the dust held outside the wall. Nothing broke. And that is exactly why the real danger is so hard to see. Because the things that will hurt the first Martians most do not break the day. They break the months. They arrive without a sound and without a single bad morning to point to. And by the time anyone can measure them, they have already been at work for a long time. To understand why living on Mars would be horrifying, you have to stop watching for the disaster and start watching for the slow ones. The dangers that do their damage quietly, in the body, in the mind, and across the long distance home. Begin with the one that is pouring through the roof at this very moment. Invisible, silent, and impossible to feel. Radiation. On Earth, you are protected by two things so vast and so constant that you have never once thanked them. The first is a magnetic field, generated deep in the planet's molten core, that wraps the entire world in an invisible shield and deflects most of the charged particles streaming in from space. The second is the atmosphere itself, a blanket of air so thick that the small amount which gets through the magnetic field is mostly absorbed before it ever reaches the ground. Together they are the reason you can stand in the open, under the sky, your whole life, and never give a thought to the storm of high-energy particles raging through the solar system all around you. Mars has neither. It lost its global magnetic field billions of years ago, and the thin scrap of atmosphere that remains offers almost no shelter. On the surface of Mars, you stand beneath a sky that does not protect you. Two kinds of radiation come through that open sky. The first is a steady, ceaseless rain of particles from far beyond the solar system, flung out and accelerated by ancient stellar explosions, traveling so fast and carrying so much energy that stopping them is extraordinarily hard. This background sleet never lets up. It is there in the day and the night, in clear weather and in storms, passing through the habitat walls, through the suits, through the human body, every hour of every day. The second kind is more sudden. When the sun throws off a violent outburst, a flare, or an eruption of particles, it can flood the space around Mars with a burst of radiation intense enough to be dangerous in a short time. The solar outburst is the sharp one, and it can arrive with little warning. We are not guessing at the numbers. When the rover that carried a radiation detector flew to Mars and then worked on the surface, it measured the dose directly, and the measurements have been studied ever since. A reference mission, the kind space agencies actually plan around, roughly 180 days of travel out, around 500 days on the surface, and another 180 days home, would expose an astronaut to a total radiation dose of about 1 sievert. That single word, sievert, is the unit scientists use to measure how much biological harm a dose of radiation does, and 1 sievert is a great deal. It is associated with something on the order of a 5% increase in a person's lifetime risk of dying from cancer. The space agencies have long held career limits for their astronauts near that very number, around 1 sievert for an entire working lifetime in space. A single trip to Mars and back would spend that whole lifetime allowance in one mission. The scientists who took these measurements offered a comparison that lands hard because it is so ordinary. The dose an astronaut absorbs during the journey is roughly like getting a full-body medical scan, the kind with the spinning ring that doctors use sparingly because of the radiation it delivers, once every 5 or 6 days. Imagine being told you must have that scan again and again every few days for the entire length of a voyage measured in months, and then for the long stay after. That is the steady background of life on the way to Mars and on the surface once you arrive. Not a single deadly blast. A slow, patient accumulation that you cannot feel happening and cannot ever undo. This is why the first homes on Mars are far more likely to be buried than to gleam under glass. Stopping that background rain takes mass, a great deal of it, layered overhead between the crew and the sky. Designs lean toward thick walls, soil heaped on the roofs, and habitats tucked under the surface or built into the sides of cliffs and old lava tubes. Natural caves of stone that could shield a settlement the way the atmosphere of Earth shields a city. And for the sudden solar outbursts, there is the idea of the storm shelter. A small, heavily protected core of the habitat where the crew can retreat when a warning comes, packing themselves into the most shielded space available and waiting for the worst of the particle flood to pass. But notice what every one of these solutions costs. The crew that came across the solar system to explore a new world would spend much of their lives beneath a layer of dirt and rock in dim, thick-walled rooms, precisely because the open Martian surface they crossed all that distance to reach is a place they cannot safely linger. The reward for arriving is a reason to stay underground, and the radiation never stops, which is the part that wears on a person. You can manage a single bad day. You cannot escape a danger that is present in every hour of every day for years, that follows you outside whenever you step out, that you carry with you in the rising count of a dose you can never spend back down. It does not hurt. It does not warn. It simply accumulates in the cells, in the long arithmetic of risk, while the crew goes about the ordinary business of staying alive. That is the first of the slow threats. And there is a quieter fear inside the radiation, one that troubles researchers in a different way than cancer does, because it threatens not the length of a life, but the mind living it. Some of the most energetic particles in that cosmic rain are heavy, fast atomic nuclei that tear through tissue in a way ordinary radiation does not. and there is real concern about what they do to the brain. In studies where rodents were exposed to beams meant to imitate this deep space radiation, researchers found lasting changes in the brain, inflammation and damage to the connections between nerve cells. And the animals did worse on tests of learning and memory, with signs of heightened anxiety. The scientists leading that work, part of the agency's own human research program, warned plainly that a journey to Mars is long enough for such effects to begin to develop. It must be said clearly that this is uncertain ground. These are largely animal studies. The doses and conditions are not a perfect match for a real crew, and no human being has yet shown such effects from spaceflight, for the simple reason that no human has yet made this journey. But the possibility is serious enough that it cannot be waved away, and its implication is chilling in a precise way. The danger is not only that the radiation might one day give a settler cancer, it is that the same radiation, working slowly on the brain, might dull the very judgment, memory, and focus. The crew leans on to survive every other hazard on this list. The attention that catches the failing pump, the clear thinking that solves the emergency. A threat that erodes the mind, erodes everything else along with it. Now turn to the second, which is at work even when the crew is safely inside, even when the shielding is perfect, even when nothing at all has gone wrong. The pull of the planet itself. Mars has gravity. After the strange floating emptiness of the journey, that is almost a relief. Things fall here. You can set a cup down and trust it to stay. You walk rather than drift. But the gravity of Mars is only about 38% of the gravity of Earth. A little over a third of the pull your body was built across millions of years to live inside. And the human body, it turns out, pays very close attention to how hard it is being pulled. We learned this the hard way in the empty orbit above Earth, where crews float in near weightlessness, and the body's response is dramatic and well documented. With no strong pull loading the skeleton, bone begins to dissolve away, the body reabsorbing material it has decided it no longer needs, at a rate that can reach 1.5% of bone mass lost in a single month. Muscle wastes, especially in the legs and back. The great muscles that on Earth spend all day quietly fighting gravity and now have almost nothing to fight. The heart, no longer working as hard to push blood upward against the planet's pull, weakens and grows smaller. Fluids that gravity normally keeps pooled in the lower body drift upward into the chest and head, puffing the face, stuffing the sinuses, and pressing in ways that can actually reshape the back of the eye and blur an astronaut's vision. A neuroocular syndrome tied directly to long spaceflight. The immune system shifts. Kidney stones become a real risk, partly because all that dissolving bone floods the body with extra calcium. This is the price of leaving full gravity behind, and it is the reason behind the hours of daily exercise we already saw folded into the crew's routine, a long and deliberate labor that slows the body's deterioration, but, even at its hardest, never quite manages to stop it. Mars sits in a place we have never tested. It is not the near weightlessness of orbit, where we know the damage well. It is not the full gravity of Earth, where the body holds together as it always has. It is something in between, more than nothing and far less than home. A level of pull that no human being has ever lived in for months or years. And so, the honest, uncomfortable truth is that nobody knows exactly what 38% gravity does to a person over the long run. We do not know whether it is enough to keep bones from thinning dangerously, or only enough to slow the loss. We do not know what it does to a heart, to eyes, to the delicate machinery of balance across years. We do not know what it does to a body that arrived already weakened by months of the journey out. We are reasonably sure it is better than weightlessness, and reasonably sure it is worse than Earth. And almost everything between those two certainties is unknown territory that the first crews would be exploring, not with instruments, but with their own bodies. There is a deeper unknown folded inside this one, and it is the kind of thing that turns a settlement into something far more permanent and far more troubling than a research base. What happens to a body that grows up in this gravity? If people are ever born and raised on Mars, their bones and muscles and hearts would form under a pull barely a third of Earth's. And there is real reason to suspect they might grow into bodies that could never safely visit the world their ancestors came from. Bodies too adapted to the lightness of Mars to stand under the full weight of Earth. We do not know. No one can know yet. But the question hangs over every dream of a lasting Martian home, and it cannot be answered by any machine. It can only be answered by living it, which means the first generations would carry the experiment in their own skeletons, with no way to take it back if the answer turns out to be cruel. So the body is under siege from two directions at once, neither of which the crew can see or feel. From above, the slow rain of radiation raising the long odds of illness. From below, or rather from the lack of pull, the quiet unmaking of bone and muscle and heart. Both are patient, both are invisible, both keep working while the crew drinks its recycled water and tends its garden and tells itself that today was a good day. And now, we come to the third slow threat, which attacks not the body, but the mind, and which may be the hardest of all to defend against, because the thing doing the damage is the very situation that keeps the crew alive. The walls. The same shell that holds the pressure and stops the dust and shields against the radiation is also a box that a small number of human beings cannot leave. On Earth, when the people around you become too much, when the room is too small, when you need to be alone or need to be somewhere else, you simply go. You walk out a door into open air, you drive somewhere, you find a different face or no face at all. That escape, so ordinary you have never counted it as a freedom, does not exist on Mars. The crew is sealed inside a handful of rooms with the same few people, seeing the same faces at every meal for a year or far longer, with no door that opens onto anywhere they would survive. The horizon outside the small windows is real, and it is also utterly unreachable without an hour of preparation, and a suit that stands between you and death. There is nowhere to go. There is only here, and these people, and these walls, again tomorrow. We have studied what that does to human beings, carefully and on purpose. The recent year-long isolation missions inside the printed habitat in Houston sealed 4 volunteers into about 1,700 square feet of space for 378 days. With simulated communication delays and limited resources, and the same confinement the real thing would impose. Earlier studies have shut crews into Antarctic stations through the long polar winter, where for months no aircraft can land and no one can leave. The closest thing on Earth to the isolation of another planet. And these studies have taught us something both reassuring and sobering. Human beings are remarkably good at this. They adapt. They build routines, find humor, form bonds, get through. But they also struggle in ways that are real and predictable. There is a well-known pattern in long confinements where morale sags badly in the later stretch. Once the novelty is long gone and the end is still not close, a low, grinding phase where small irritations swell and the weight of the sameness presses down hardest. The first crew to finish a year-long simulation spoke when they finally came out, not of grand existential terror, but of something quieter and more human. They missed green grass. They missed a blue sky. They missed the simple feeling of fresh air moving across their faces. After a year sealed inside, it was the small, free, ordinary pieces of Earth they ached for most. Now layer onto that confinement the fact that there is no relief coming. In Antarctica, the winter ends and the planes return. In the Houston habitat, the door opens after 378 days and the crew walks out into a Texas afternoon. On Mars, there is no such date. The confinement is not a season to be survived. It is simply the condition of being there, with the next resupply ship months away at best, and the journey home only possible during rare windows when the two planets line up. Windows that come around roughly every 2 years. A crew that decided on their first ordinary morning that they had made a terrible mistake would not be able to leave for a very long time, and they would know it. That knowledge, the absence of any quick way out, is its own quiet pressure, and it sits underneath every disagreement, every bad mood, every long stretch of boredom, colouring all of it with the awareness that there is no escape hatch from the situation, or from each other. And here the fourth, slow threat enters and makes everything heavier, because it cuts the crew off from the one thing that might have eased all the rest. The voice of home. Mars and Earth are not at a fixed distance from each other. They circle the sun on their own paths, sometimes on the same side and relatively close, sometimes on opposite sides and very far apart. And because even radio signals, the fastest messengers we have, travel at the speed of light and no faster, the distance becomes a delay. When the planets are near, a message takes around 3 minutes to cross the gap one way. When they are far, it takes up to around 22 minutes one way, which means that a conversation, the ordinary back and forth of two people talking, becomes impossible. You speak, and your words travel for as long as 22 minutes before anyone on Earth hears them, and then their reply travels the same long road back, so that the shortest possible gap between asking a question and hearing the answer can stretch toward 3/4 of an hour. You cannot talk to your family. You can only send them messages and wait, and receive their messages sent long ago, two streams of words passing each other in the dark, never quite meeting. Think about what that does to a relationship. A child on Earth tells a parent on Mars about their day, and by the time the parent's response arrives, the child has gone to bed. A piece of good news, a piece of bad news, a joke, an argument, all of it arrives already aged, answered into a silence that has long since moved on. The warmth of a real conversation, the interruption, the laughter that lands at the right moment, the comfort of a voice responding right now is gone, replaced by a slow exchange of recordings across a void. Crews describe even the simulated version of this as one of the lonelier parts of the whole experience, because it takes the people you love most and places them not just far away, but slightly out of time, always speaking to a version of you that no longer exists by the time they answer. And the delay does more than strain the heart. It changes what help even means. On Earth, in any real trouble, you can reach an expert in seconds. A doctor on the line, a specialist talking a frightened person through a crisis as it unfolds, adjusting their advice breath by breath. On Mars, that is impossible. If something goes wrong, the crew can describe it and send the description into space, and then they must wait. Minutes that feel like hours for an answer that was written before the situation had finished changing. The best engineers and physicians on Earth, an entire planet of expertise, are reduced by the speed of light to slow correspondence, always responding to a problem as it was, never as it is. In a true emergency, the crew on Mars is, for all practical purposes, alone, holding the line by themselves, while their distant help speaks to them across a gap that no amount of brilliance or money or will can close. Nobody is coming. Nobody can even talk to them in real time. They have only each other and whatever they carried with them. There is one more turn of this screw, and it is the kind of detail that sounds invented and is simply true. Roughly every 2 years, in their endless circling, Earth and Mars pass to opposite sides of the Sun, so that the Sun itself sits directly between them. When that happens, the Sun's roaring interference drowns the radio signals passing near it, and for about 2 weeks, communication between the two planets becomes unreliable and at times impossible. The crew on Mars goes silent, not by choice, but because the geometry of the solar system has placed a wall of fire across the only road their words can travel. For those 2 weeks, every 2 years, the people on Mars are cut off from home almost entirely, left to manage whatever comes with no messages in or out, waiting for the planets to drift far enough apart that the Sun releases its grip on the signal. They know it is coming. They count down to it. And they sit through it, the most isolated human beings who have ever lived, on a world that does not care, beneath a sky that does not protect them. This is the true weight of living on Mars, and none of it is the disaster. The radiation, the failing bones, the box with no exit, the voice of home arriving 20 minutes late, and falling silent for weeks at a time. These are the good days. These are the days when everything works. The horror, if that is the word, is not in any single moment, but in the slow accumulation. The sense of a body and a mind under steady, patient pressure from every side at once, with no relief on the calendar and no quick rescue if the pressure ever turns sharp. And it can turn sharp. That is the thing the routine keeps almost hidden. All of these slow threats share one terrible feature. They steadily erode the margin, the small cushion of safety and strength and supplies and sanity that stands between an ordinary day and a deadly one. A body weakened by radiation and low gravity is a body less able to survive a sudden crisis. A mind worn thin by confinement and isolation is a mind more likely to miss a warning or make a mistake. A crew cut off from real-time help is a crew that must face any emergency with whatever they have on hand and in their own heads. The slow dangers are not separate from the fast ones. They are the ground the fast ones grow in. They thin the margin quietly, day after day, until the day a single thing goes wrong, and the crew discovers all at once how little cushion is left, and how completely alone they truly are. On Mars, that day always comes. Not because Mars is cruel, but because machines fail, and bodies fail, and no system runs forever without something, somewhere, breaking at the worst possible time. The only question is what breaks, and when, and whether the people inside the wall have enough left in their thinned margin to survive it. So let us stop imagining the good day and watch what happens on the day the bargain finally fails, when an alarm sounds in the night and there is no one within 20 minutes who can even hear it. It is the middle of the Martian night, and the alarm is the wrong kind. The crew has learned the sounds of the habitat the way you learn the breathing of someone you love asleep beside you. There is the steady hum that means everything is well. There are the small, expected chimes, a filter due for cleaning, a tank reading a little low, a scheduled task waiting. Those sounds do not wake anyone anymore, but there is another sound, one they have heard only in training. A tone pitched to cut through sleep and dreams and reach the oldest, most frightened part of the brain. And when it comes in the dark, every one of them is awake before they understand why. They know before they read a single screen that the bargain has failed. Something that was supposed to keep running has stopped. The screen tells them it is the air. Specifically, the system that scrubs the carbon dioxide out of the cabin, the machine that captures the gas they breathe out before it can build to a level that would dull their thinking, then sicken them, then kill them. It has faltered. A pump, perhaps. A valve. A clogged bed of the material that does the scrubbing. The diagnosis on the screen is not certain, because the habitat is not a hospital full of specialists. It is a small machine, in a small building far from anyone who built it. What the screen knows for certain is the number that matters. The level of carbon dioxide in the air the crew is breathing. And that number, which should sit low and steady, has begun to climb. This is the moment the whole story has been walking toward. And it is not the explosion that films love. There is no fire, no breach, no hull torn open to the screaming sky. The walls are intact. The pressure holds. The power is on. From the outside, nothing looks wrong at all. The horror is quieter and far more honest than any blast. A single machine in the long chain of machines has stopped doing its one job. And because the crew lives inside a sealed bubble where the air does not blow away on any wind, the consequence of that small failure begins, immediately and invisibly, to fill the room. They are being poisoned by their own breath, in their own home, and the thing that was preventing it has gone silent. On Earth, this is not a deadly event. On Earth, carbon dioxide builds up in a stuffy, crowded room, and you crack a window, and the planet's vast ocean of fresh air pours in and carries the problem away, without your ever knowing how close it came to mattering. There is no window here. There is no ocean of air outside. Outside is a near vacuum of poison colder than anything on Earth, and the only fresh, breathable atmosphere that exists for 200 million kilometers in any direction is the few rooms the crew is standing in, and that atmosphere is going bad. The first instinct of every human being to open a door and let the bad air out and the good air in is the one instinct that here would kill them faster than the carbon dioxide ever could. The planet has taken away even the oldest reflex of survival and turned it into a death sentence. So the crew does what they have trained to do and watch how the training has shaped them, because it tells you everything about what living on Mars truly demands. They do not panic, or rather, they feel the panic and set it aside, because panic burns oxygen and clouds judgment, and there is no one else to think for them. They split the work without being told. One goes to the failed system itself, pulling the panel, looking with their own eyes and hands at the machine, because there is no technician to send and no replacement to order overnight. Another moves to bring a backup online. This is the moment the whole grim logic of the base proves itself. the second machine that has waited in the dark for precisely this, now carrying the load that its twin could no longer hold. A third begins to manage the air itself, opening reserves of stored breathable atmosphere, deploying the simpler chemical canisters that can absorb carbon dioxide directly. The same low, reliable technology that once saved a crew of astronauts stranded around the moon who, as the carbon dioxide rose dangerously inside their crippled craft, had to build a scrubber from spare parts by following instructions read up to them from the ground. The crew on Mars has those instructions in their own heads. They have to. There is no other way. And here is where the distance home stops being an abstraction and becomes the most physical fact in the room. They send the alarm to Earth, of course, the moment it sounds. The data streams out into space at the speed of light, the fastest anything can travel, carrying every reading, every fault code, every desperate detail to the people who designed this machine and know it better than anyone alive. But the planets are far apart tonight, and the message will travel for the better part of 20 minutes before a single human on Earth even sees that anything is wrong. By the time the experts read the alarm, lean toward their screens, and begin to understand, the crisis on Mars will already be 20 minutes older than the version they are looking at. And when they have understood it, and conferred, and written their careful, brilliant advice, that advice has to travel the same long road back, another 20 minutes through the dark, before the crew can hear a word of it. The shortest possible time between the crew's cry for help and the first syllable of an answer is close to 3/4 of an hour. The carbon dioxide does not wait 3/4 of an hour. It climbs the whole time. So the truth the crew lives with every day, the truth they have perhaps let themselves forget on all the good mornings, arrives now with total clarity. In the only time frame that matters, the minutes when a life is decided, they are alone. The entire expertise of Earth, the engineers who built this system, the physicians who trained them, the agency that sent them, all of it is real and all of it is reaching toward them, and none of it can touch this moment. Help is not late. Help is structurally, permanently, by the unbreakable law of the speed of light, unable to arrive in time. The crew is not waiting for rescue. There is no rescue. There is only what they carry in their hands and their heads and each other right now, in this room, with the number still climbing. They work. The one at the failed machine finds the fault, or finds it well enough. A fouled component. A part that has reached the end of its life out here where nothing can be sent for. They have a spare, because someone, years ago and millions of kilometers away, thought to pack one, and the survival of these 4 people tonight rests on that long ago decision as much as on anything they do now. They make the change with cold fingers and careful hands, knowing that a fumble, a dropped part, a wrong connection, costs air they cannot spare. The one managing the reserves keeps the room breathable by the slimmest margin, watching the stored supply fall as it buys them the time to make the repair, aware that the reserve too is finite, that everything here is finite, that there is no deep well of safety beneath them, only the supplies they brought and whatever strength the long months had not already quietly spent. And the backup comes online. The number stops climbing. Then, slowly, it begins to fall. The air clears. The bad version of the future, the one where it did not fall, recedes back into the dark where it came from, and the crew stands in the small hours of a Martian night, breathing carefully, soaked in the particular exhaustion that comes after fear, and alive. They did it themselves. Of course they did. There was never going to be anyone else. Almost an hour after the alarm first sounded, the first message from Earth arrives. It is calm and competent and kind, and it is answering a crisis that ended before the words were written, advising the crew on a problem they have already solved or already died of, and tonight, mercifully, solved. They send back word that they are all right. That message, too, will travel 20 minutes home, so that somewhere on Earth, a room full of people who love them and are responsible for them will spend the better part of an hour not yet knowing whether the crew is alive, watching old data, helpless, until the words finally cross the gap. There was never a moment in this entire emergency when the two worlds were speaking to each other in the present. They were always speaking to each other's pasts. Two planets calling across a delay that no urgency could shorten, and in the gap between them, the crew faced the thing alone. Now, sit with what that emergency actually revealed, because it is the heart of everything this story has tried to say. The crew survived. The systems worked, the backups held, the training held, the spare part was there. By every measure the mission planners use, this was a success. And yet, there is something in it that should make your skin go cold. And it is not the danger of the night itself. It is what the night exposed about every other night. Because the only reason the carbon dioxide began to climb is that a machine was the only thing holding it back. And the only reason the crew survived is that another machine was waiting to take its place. And the only reason that machine was there is that the danger had been foreseen and engineered against in advance. Strip away the drama and what remains is a simple, permanent fact. On Mars, the difference between an ordinary night and a deadly one is whether a machine keeps working. Every night. Forever. This is the truth that has been gathering through this whole story, and now it can be said plainly. Living on Mars would not feel like moving to a new world. It would feel like living inside a fragile machine that must continuously protect you from the planet outside. The habitat is not a home that happens to have life support. The life support is the home, and the rooms are simply the shape it takes. The crew does not live on Mars in any sense that matches what that word means on Earth. They live inside a thin, manufactured layer of Earth-like conditions, a pocket of breathable air and bearable warmth and survivable pressure, held in place by hardware and power and ceaseless human attention, while the actual planet presses against it from every side, indifferent, unrelenting, and entirely willing to flood in the instant the layer fails. And it is so thin, that layer. That is the part the imagination resists. We picture a new world as something vast, and Mars as vast, a whole planet of canyons and volcanoes and frozen plains, more land than all of Earth's continents combined. But none of it is for the crew. All of that immensity is hostile. The only part of Mars where a human being can actually live is the few cubic meters of air inside the wall, a space you could walk across in seconds, surrounded by a planet that offers nothing. The settlers would stand at their small windows and look out at an entire world they had crossed the solar system to reach, and they could not step into a single meter of it without carrying their fragile pocket of Earth with them. Sealed into a suit, breathing canned air, the planet held at arm's length even then. They came all that way to arrive somewhere they can never truly go outside. Think of what the human body and mind are doing in that pocket, all at once, on the good days as much as the bad. The lungs are breathing air a machine produced, and another machine cleaned. The thirst is being met with water that passed through the crew's own bodies and through filters that must never fail. The bones are quietly thinning under a gravity too weak to hold them together the way Earth did. The cells are absorbing a slow, ceaseless dose of radiation that no roof fully stops. The count rising toward limits that on Earth would end a career. The mind is pressed against the same few faces, in the same few rooms, with no door to anywhere survivable, no relief on the calendar, no quick way home. And the heart is reaching out across the dark toward everyone it loves, and finding only messages arriving 20 minutes late, falling silent entirely for 2 weeks, every 2 years when the sun stands between the worlds. All of this is happening on the good days. All of this is the success. This is what it costs to keep 4 human beings alive on the surface of Mars when nothing has gone wrong at all. And the failures will come, because they always come. Not every night, not even most nights. But machines wear out, and parts fatigue, and software stumbles, and the slow erosion of radiation and isolation and partial gravity steadily thins the margin that stands between the crew and the next crisis. Worn down over months, a body has less reserve and a mind less sharpness for the night the air finally fails. And the help that might have saved them on Earth. The slow dangers and the fast ones are not separate threats. The slow ones are the soil the fast ones grow in. Every quiet month of accumulating dose and dissolving bone and grinding sameness is a month in which the crew becomes a little less able to survive the loud emergency when it finally arrives. And the help that might have saved them on Earth in 30 seconds is 20 minutes away at the speed of light. Which is to say, in the moment that counts, it is not there at all. Consider the medical version of that same horror, because it makes the distance unbearable in a different way. On Earth, a sudden illness, an infection turning dangerous, an appendix swelling toward rupture, a heart stumbling out of rhythm is frightening but survivable, because the full weight of modern medicine can be brought to bear within the hour. A hospital, a surgeon, a specialist who has seen this 1,000 times. On Mars, the crew has among them whatever medical training they were given and whatever supplies they carried, and nothing more. If someone falls seriously ill, there is no evacuation. The journey home is not measured in hours of helicopter flight, but in months of space flight, and only during the rare windows when the planets align. A person who needs a surgeon, Mars does not have, will not get one. The crew will do what they can, guided by physicians on Earth who are doing their best across a delay that turns every exchange into a letter, and they will succeed, or they will fail. And if they fail, they will have to go on living in the same small rooms beside the place where it happened, with the next resupply still months away, and the door to home still closed. The isolation that is merely lonely on the good days becomes, in a medical crisis, a kind of abandonment that no one chose, and no one can undo. There is a particular cruelty in the fact that none of this is Mars being malicious. The planet is not trying to kill the crew. A planet cannot try anything. Mars is simply being what it is, a cold, dry, airless, irradiated world that formed under its own laws and has gone about its business for billions of years, with perfect indifference to whether anything lives or dies on its surface. It does not know the crew is there. It would not change a single degree of its temperature or a single particle of its dust if every human on it vanished tonight. That indifference is somehow worse than hostility. Hostility, at least, is a kind of attention. Mars offers none. The crew pours every hour of their lives into not dying on a world that will never once notice the effort, and that, more than any single danger, is the weight they carry. They are guests of a place that does not know it has guests, surviving on a planet that would not register their absence. So, what does it actually feel like, in the end, to live on Mars? It feels like vigilance that never gets to rest. It feels like the low hum of machines you have learned to stop hearing, until the night the pitch changes and your whole body knows before your mind does. It feels like exercising for 2 hours not to grow strong, but to fall apart more slowly. It feels like looking at an entire world through a small, thick window you cannot open. It feels like loving people who answer 20 minutes late. It feels like knowing, underneath every ordinary moment, that you are alive only because a chain of machines is working, and that you are part of the chain, and that the chain has no slack and no end, and no one to take your place if you falter. It feels like home and life support being the same thing, so that you can never fully relax inside your own walls, because relaxing inside your own walls would mean trusting the planet, and the planet cannot be trusted, ever, for a single hour. The first Martians, then, would not be pioneers settling a frontier in the way the old stories promised. Hardy folk building cabins under an open sky and watching their children run across new fields. There would be no open sky to build under and no fields to run across. And any children, if there were ever children, would grow up never feeling fresh air on their faces, never standing in unfiltered sunlight, their bodies forming under a pull so weak that Earth itself might become a place they could never safely visit. The first Martians would be something stranger and lonelier than pioneers. They would be the permanent keepers of a fragile machine, tending the systems that tend them in a small sealed pocket of borrowed Earth, on the surface of a world that remains, after all their effort and all their courage, completely and forever outside the wall. That is the horror, and it is worth being precise about what kind of horror it is, because it is not the kind the word usually means. It is not the horror of a monster or a sudden death. It is the horror of dependence without end. It is the horror of knowing that every ordinary, peaceful, even happy day you ever have on Mars is a day that disaster was successfully prevented. By machines, and by people, and by the thinning margin between you and a planet that wants nothing and gives nothing, and waits with infinite patience for the layer of Earth around you to fail. It is the horror of confinement so total that the entire reachable universe is a few small rooms. It is the horror of fragility made permanent. A life in which the most basic act, taking the next breath, is never once guaranteed by the world around you, and always, always has to be manufactured. We may go anyway. That is the strange and human truth underneath all of this. People have always gone to hard places, paid impossible prices, endured what should not be endurable for reasons that are not entirely rational and are not entirely about survival. And some of us will almost certainly go to Mars knowing every word of what you have just heard, and go gladly. This story is not an argument that it cannot be done, or even that it should not be. The isolation studies prove that human beings can live this way and stay sane and stay kind and even laugh. The engineering is real and getting realer. It is, in the most literal sense, possible. But possible is not the same as gentle. And arriving is not the same as living. And that gap is the whole truth of the thing. The dream sells you the landing, the boot in the red dust, the flag that cannot wave. It does not sell you the second morning, or the 10,000 mornings after, each one beginning with the same quiet question, answered by the same quiet hum. Did the machines hold through the night? On Earth, you have never once had to ask that question, because a living planet answers it for you before you wake, every day of your life, for free, without your knowing the question existed. That, in the end, may be the deepest thing Mars has to teach the people who go there, and the rest of us who never will. It is the lesson written into every recycled drop of water and every shielded wall and every message that arrives 20 minutes too late. We didn't build the thin layer of air and warmth and pressure that keeps us alive. We were born inside one so vast and so old and so reliable that we mistook it for the way things simply are. The first Martians would spend their whole lives building that layer by hand and guarding it with their lives, in the dark, on a world that does not care. And in doing so, they would finally understand what the rest of us have always taken for granted. That to live anywhere is to be held inside something fragile. On Earth, the planet holds it for you. On Mars, you would have to hold it yourself, every hour, forever, with the cold and the silence pressing in, and no one coming, and no window you could ever open